Welcome everyone to another LBCA Advocate Chat meeting. We're excited to be here today. I think this is listed as our last spring session, even though it's sort of the height of summer, but we won't have any probably until the fall after this one. But we're really excited to bring this session today on advocacy opportunities at the federal level, and look forward to sharing that with you. A couple of pointers about today's session, as you know now, and I think you've all checked that you accept. Today's presentation portion will be recorded and you will all be muted, but the Q&A session will not be recorded. And we do ask that as the presenters are going, you can start entering your questions into the chat throughout the presentation. And then during the Q&A portion, questions from the chat will be read and we will potentially call on people as well. And please note, we cannot take any questions about personal medical conditions or personal specific issues, and we can't address them during this. So I'd like to introduce our two speakers. They're going to go one at a time. So I will introduce them one at a time, but I'll introduce them both now. We have with us today Breeze Riley. She's from the National Cancer Institute. She's the Advocacy Relations Manager. She's an Advocacy Relations Manager for the Office of Advocacy Relations at the National Cancer Institute. And in this role, she works with individual research advocates and organizations to ensure that the collective patient perspective is incorporated into NCI's research and initiatives. She also manages communication outreach to advocate stakeholders. Prior to joining the NCI, she managed advocacy programs and health communication campaigns for government and pharmaceutical clients at Porto Novelli. And after we hear from Breeze, we're going to hear from Salina Miller. Salina serves as the manager of the FDA's Patient Representative Program, the agency's flagship initiative that ensures patient perspectives are included in the medical product review process. Ms. Miller works to respond to the agency's needs and requests for patient representatives for all of the agency's medical product centers by actively recruiting and training patients and caregivers for various agency-directed assignments and activities. Ms. Miller resides within FDA's Advisory Committee Oversight and Management Staff, ACOMS, under the agency's Office of the Commissioner. She joined ACOMS in April 2018 after 6 years within the Office of the Commissioner's Office of External Affairs, where she served as the office's primary stakeholder lead for neurology, psychiatry, and anti-malarial related issues. Prior to FDA, Ms. Miller was with FDA's sister agency, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, for nearly 18 years, where she worked on issues related to patient safety, medical errors, and hospital-acquired infections. Ms. Miller received a Master of Science and a Master of Business Administration in Biotechnology from Johns Hopkins University in 2008. And without further ado, I think we're going to hear first from Breeze.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Lori. So as Lori mentioned, I'll be giving an overview today of NCI, our office, and advocate engagement at NCI. Next slide, please. So NCI is the largest of the 27 components of NIH, and NCI itself is comprised of 30 divisions, offices, and centers working together to build, maintain, and enhance a comprehensive cancer research agenda. And NCI leads what is sometimes known as the National Cancer Program, which includes other federal agencies such as FDA, who you'll be hearing from, CDC, and CMS. As the leader of the National Cancer Program, NCI conducts and supports research and training, disseminates health information, and manages programs with respect to understanding the cause, diagnosis, prevention, treatment of cancer, and continuing care of cancer patients. Next slide, please. As you can see, NCI's work runs the full gambit of different areas of cancer research. NCI's goal is to support research that ultimately leads to important clinical outcomes, including improvement in prevention, diagnosis, and treatment that can reduce the incidence, morbidity, and mortality of all cancer types. This requires a wide range of research ranging from the continuum of basic science to clinical research, from cancer biology to clinical trials and survivorship. NCI's research and portfolio encompasses all elements of the cancer research continuum. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, NCI is comprised of 30 divisions, offices, and centers who all work together to achieve this goal. And our research program includes both intramural and extramural research. So the intramural program are the people who are working in Bethesda, Maryland, where I work as well, the scientists, physicians, and clinicians. Well, some of them are in Frederick too, but in Maryland anyway. Scientists, physicians, and clinicians who conduct basic clinical and genomic and population-based science. So that includes our Center for Cancer Research and the Division of Cancer Epidemiology and Genetics. And then 80% of NCI's funding actually goes to what we call the extramural research. And that is the work being done by non-government scientists in laboratories and clinical facilities throughout the country. Some of you listening in might have worked with scientists in your community before, and they might be doing research funded by NCI. So that includes our Division of Cancer Biology, Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences, Division of Cancer Prevention, Division of Cancer Treatment and Diagnosis, and Division of Extramural Activities. As I said, a lot of divisions, we work with all of them. Next slide, please. Advocate engagement is really important to us at NCI. At NCI, we believe that research advocates bring a unique and critical viewpoint to the cancer research process, ensuring the collective patient perspective is integrated into the cancer research enterprise. As you can see, we have support from the top. This is a quote from our director, Dr. Ned Sharpless. He says, "Advocates' dedication to cancer research and improving outcomes for patients helps make the work of the NCI and its investigators possible. I commend all of them for their passion and commitment." And that's not just lip service. Dr. Sharpless himself is often engaged with the advocate community, meeting with organizations and individual advocates on issues around research and other issues around cancer care. Next slide, please. So now getting to my office and what we actually do. So NCI's Office of Advocacy Relations is what we like to call the front door for advocates here at NCI. We engage cancer research advocates and serve as a link to advocate stakeholders to collaborate with NCI. We work with individual research advocates, local and national advocacy groups, and professional societies to ensure the collective patient perspective is included in NCI efforts to advance cancer research and improve patient outcomes. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about what we do. We coordinate engagement across the cancer research advocacy community to improve understanding, opportunity, and progress in cancer research. To achieve that, you can kind of put it into three broad functions. We communicate NCI's priorities and initiatives throughout the community through different communications vehicles. We also listen to what the community has to say and bring that back to the NCI. Making sure that feedback gets back to leadership at NCI. We facilitate bi-directional engagements, which means matching advocates to activities as well at NCI, as well as referring NCI speakers out to the community to present at meetings and conferences. And lastly, we collaborate with the community to illuminate new opportunities and partnerships that leverage our diverse resources and identify overlapping priorities. Next slide, please. So this slide talks a little bit more about how we work with program staff. I mentioned that we work with program staff across the entire institute. So our office specifically consults on how advocates can be effectively integrated into new or existing NCI programs and initiatives. We work with program staff if there are any specific concerns that arise around a particular advocate engagement or activity. We field any advocate inquiries that are redirected from program staff, and we advise program staff on issues important to the advocacy community, which speaks back to that bi-directional engagement I was talking about earlier. Next slide, please. And in parallel to that, we're working with program staff internally, but we're working with advocates in the community. We serve as conduit between the cancer advocacy community and NCI research and program staff. We recommend creative solutions for advocate engagement at NCI. We vet and recruit trained advocates for NCI opportunities. and we ensure advocates are positioned for success and prepared to add value to NCI's work. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we're talking to individual research advocates as well as advocacy organizations. In our own network, we have about 259 active advocates, and that's spanning different cancer types and geographic regions. Not every individual advocate we work with chooses to join our more formal network, or we work with them in other ways. So this just represents a small portion of who we talk to. And in 2020, we recruited 7 new advocates, which is actually a little low for us. I think you can guess why 2020 was a lower year. We've already outpaced that this year. So just to say, we are always building our network and looking for new people to work with. And then, as I mentioned, we work with advocacy organizations to improve understanding of policy, partnerships, and strategic investments in cancer research. Next slide, please. Oh, it skipped around. I'm not. Yeah, this one. Okay, thanks. One of the ways in which OR supports a culture of advocate engagement, as I said, is referring advocates for these different programs. So oftentimes those referrals come from our network or they come from elsewhere in the community. In 2020, we referred 57 advocates for activities at NCI, in addition to referring advocates for activities with external partners such as other federal agencies and organizations. Examples of a few of those NCI activities, which I'll get into more detail later, are steering committees and advisory committees, our NCI Council of Research Advocates, which is a federal advisory board similar to our scientific boards that advise the director, but this one is made up exclusively of advocates. I think we have it kind of ranges in size, but I think we have around 12 or 13 right now. Peer review, which you might have done with other organizations as well, speaking engagements and workshops. And it's really important to note that 57 figure only captures referrals that come directly from our staff at OAR. It does not include advocates who are already engaged in multiple year programs. So if they're in the 3rd year of their term, it wouldn't necessarily capture that number. And it doesn't capture advocates who were referred by program staff outside of our office. So that's actually a pretty small slice of the number of advocates actively working at NCI in any given year. Next slide, please. This slide just gives you a sense of some of the other ways we engage advocates throughout the year and how you can keep in touch with us. We're happy to field one-on-one phone calls to discuss any relevant issues that advocates are interested in. We have a monthly newsletter, which I encourage you to sign up for by visiting our website, and that information will be at the end of the presentation. We host webinars. Again, those have fallen off slightly since the pandemic started, but we're looking forward to hosting more of those soon. And if you sign up for our listserv, you'll get information about those as well. And then we're happy to convene one-on-one meetings either with our program staff or with other scientific staff at the NCI. Next slide, please. This is a question you're probably asking, what do we look for in an NCI research advocate? So we don't have really formal requirements that other programs might have because our engagements vary so differently that program staff might be looking for a different thing on any given engagement. But there are a few core things we look for within an advocate. That first thing is personal experience from one's own diagnosis or connection to someone diagnosed with cancer. So this can be any sort of connection to cancer. It's just kind of distinguishing from someone who might have a research or clinical background. Then we do have a few advocates who have both. Affiliated with a cancer research organization. Again, this is not a requirement, but many of our advocates work with academic sites in their local community or a nonprofit. Prior involvement in cancer research advocacy or advocacy training is really important. Unfortunately, our office cannot offer advocacy training. To be honest, we don't have the budget or bandwidth for it. So we look for advocates to get that within the community from organizations like LBCA. You know, these webinars are great ways to learn, and there are other training programs within the community. Again, that ability to convey a collective patient perspective over one's own exclusive disease experience, we really look for advocates to be able to check their biases at the door, because what we're looking for is to, fund the best science. So we want advocates who can kind of check any bias at the door while bringing that collective patient experience over their individual experience. So of course that informs their experience. And then comfort interacting with diverse audiences and teams while engaging in scientific discussions and reviewing scientific material. We want to make sure people are comfortable working with program staff and scientists and aren't afraid to speak up, because their perspective is very valuable and we want to make sure that comes across. Next slide, please. So this slide just gives you kind of a visual overview of some of the opportunities within NCI, and I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions in the Q&A. Some of these I mentioned earlier, our patient advocate steering committee are comprised of task force and work group advocates. DEA peer review, which I mentioned earlier, our NCI Council of Research Advocates also sits within DEA, the Division of Extramural Activities. Many programs have advocates on their advisory board, such as the Physical Sciences Oncology Network and many of the programs being funded through the Cancer Moonshot Initiative. And then again, this is just an overview of what makes NCI a little different from our federal partners, is that the range of advocate opportunities available, some of them are ones offered year over year regularly, like peer review or the steering committees. And some might be a one-day engagement where you attend a workshop or you attend monthly meetings for a year for a planning committee. It really does vary. Next slide, please. I know we're limited on time, but I did want to give at least one case study just so you can see a little bit more in depth about when the advocate's role might be within NCI. This example is our Physical Sciences Oncology Network, which is an extramural program, and there are advocates serving on each site of these centers. But there are a few of the advocates who serve on the Patient Advocacy Working Group, and that is administered by NCI. So they participate in bi-monthly teleconferences to share information and best practices. They engage as a member of the research team, contributing to dissemination, translation, outreach, and education efforts. And then below you can see just some of their many contributions within the last year or so. They participated in the 2020 virtual annual investigators meeting. They served on the planning committee. They served as poster judges. They presented themselves and facilitated breakout sessions. They contribute to program mission statements, providing the patient perspective, engaged in community outreach, and then work a lot with the junior investigators. So you can see they're very engaged and treated as equal and valued members as a part of this program. And I think it's definitely a great example of some of the ways we work with advocates beyond that basic peer review or steering committees. Next slide, please. So I just want to say thank you for listening. I hope this presentation has been helpful. I know it's a lot of information to go over because NCI is such a large place, so I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions. For those of you who are interested in working with NCI and think you might be a good fit for our network, I encourage you to reach out to us using that email. And our next step after that would be setting up a call to get to know you more and learn about your interests. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Salina to tell you more about FDA. Thank you.
Thank you, Breeze. I actually learned a lot on that, so it was really a treat for me. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Salina Miller. I work at FDA. I'm really happy to be here and share more about the FDA Patient Representative Program. And I first want to thank everyone at LBCA and the whole team for making this happen and having me be part of this chat. I'm excited to share more about this program. Next slide. So just to give you a brief agenda of what I plan to cover, I'm going to talk a little bit about how FDA started to engage with patients, of course, discuss the Patient Representative Program, some of our recruitment efforts, and who we go to and how do we get leads, and then discuss some of the eligibility criteria to see if a patient rep is okay to serve and appropriate to serve. And of course, share some of the contact information for any of those who are interested. Next slide. So FDA really got involved in the patient aspect way back in the late 80s, early 90s during the HIV/AIDS crisis. And what they learned during that time from the HIV and AIDS community was that this community was willing to take certain risks in order to develop products for their patient community. So we had brought them into the regulatory discussion, and it was real instrumental on providing and approving products for their communities. And in 1991, the very first patient representative served on the Antiviral Drugs Advisory Committee. And that was really the impetus for the program. If you want to learn more about the evolution of patient engagement at the agency, I included a link at the bottom, and I think you can access it after the chat. Next slide. So the agency since then has really launched so many initiatives for patients and caregivers. And this is just a small list of the activities that we have at the agency. Some of them are probably recognizable, but every one of the medical product centers, from devices, drugs, biologics, they all have their own type of initiatives. And so everyone's kind of, obviously we work very close together, but we all have our own areas of expertise. Now, my area is the FDA Patient Representative Program, so I'm going to focus on that for today. If you want to learn more about the patient engagement opportunities at FDA, you can go to the link at the bottom as well. Next slide. So what is the program? This program is unique in the sense that it brings patients to the table, front and center, providing their input and perspectives to the regulatory work that we do. By participating, patients are heavily vetted, both on their experience as an advocate, but also, looking at the big picture of who they are as an advocate in terms of ties to any organizations, any companies. So we're essentially bringing them on as a government employee. It is a 4-year term, so it is considered as a special government employee. We can hire regular government employees as well. They unfortunately cannot be employees of FDA, but we are able to use these mechanisms so that we're bringing patients on, able to compensate them and pay them for their service. And part of the reason why is because this role does give access to confidential and proprietary information. So that's why we have to screen them heavily. Next slide. So the primary way that patient representative serves is on advisory committees. These committees are brought together so the agency is able to have a public discussion on whether or not, for example, it should approve a product or it should take it off the market. Make any regulatory decision, really. If we want to consult with a committee, we ask them to provide a recommendation, and then the FDA takes all that information and makes a final decision. So these committees are public. There are about 31 committees that we have, and one of the committees, the Medical Devices Advisory Committee, has 18 panels. Of these committees, there are various committee members, including the chair, some of the specialists, scientists, experts, statisticians, epidemiologists, representatives from consumer organizations, a representative from industry, and also an FDA patient representative. So that role is very important because it's representing the whole community. I included a link to the calendar in case any of you would like to see a meeting in real time. We have listed upcoming meetings. We also have previous meetings that are recorded that you can watch and kind of see how things are played out. It's very, very interesting, so I encourage you to do that. Next slide. And not as common, but secondarily, we do ask the patient representatives for consultations in the event that the regulatory team feels that they need to learn more about a disease or condition. So for example, if a company submitted an application and say they're making certain claims or they have a product where it's indicated for something, the agency's clinical review team is able to tap into the patient representatives to say, okay, teach us about, give us some input about what you deal with day to day with your condition so that the team can make a very educated decision on next steps. So again, this type of activity it could provide some confidential information from the company, but it is not public, it is confidential, and generally it's a teleconference. Next slide. So over the years, we've had hundreds of conditions, diseases, experiences with drugs and medical devices from patients since the beginning of the 90s. And so this is just a snapshot of some of them. We obviously can't recruit for every single area because we really, only recruit based on need. But I did want to highlight the oncology areas, the cancers that we do have represented. And some of them I'm still looking for representation, but these are a list of some of the ones that we do have in the program. Next slide. So how do we recruit? Essentially, much like what Breeze was sharing, we cast a wide net. We talked to our federal partners, and in this case, Breeze and I had a conversation weeks ago about this program, and she kind of led me into introducing me to LBCA, and so that's kind of how this happened. So that it's really ad hoc. We do whatever it takes to get out there, network, educate people about the program and the needs of the program. We talk to local groups, we talk to providers, we talk to rare disease groups. We have relationships with a lot of these organizations. And also internally, we talk to our internal staff. Many of them have FaceTime with these groups. So it's really, really a good opportunity for us to find out from them, how these advocates are and how these groups are. So we do work internally as well. Oftentimes patients, go to the website and they provide or they send an email on their interest. So that's self-nominations, and that's also been very, very helpful as well. And we do tap into the current pool of patient reps for any leads because they already know what's expected, and so they can kind of do the pre-vetting as well. We do social media outreach. I've been known to email, cold call, or email people just based on a blog that they've written. So it really is anything and everything that we can do to get the word out. Oftentimes I don't have a lot of time to recruit, so I do like to kind of be proactive. And as I mentioned, recruitment is based on the agency's needs. So it's not like we can recruit for every single condition. And I do want to point out that currently I am actively recruiting for metastatic breast cancer and non-metastatic breast cancer. So these areas, I'm running into some challenges when it comes to conflicts of interest, but these are the two big areas that I am recruiting for currently. Next slide. So how do you become a patient rep? What's the criteria? As I was listening to Breeze, it's very similar to the NCI research advocate role. Being a patient themselves, the personal experience is really important, whether it's a disease condition or even a device or even a drug. We do have a lot of meetings on opioids, so pain management. So, many oncology patients do have experience with pain. So sometimes they'll have experience with opioids, and I can use them in those capacities as well. But having that personal experience is really important. We also know for some conditions that can be challenging, and so they have a guardian or a caregiver represent them in that case. Being 18 years or older, a U.S. citizen or a green card holder, obviously very active in their community as an advocate. It doesn't mean you have to go to all of the meetings or speak at conferences or on panels. It could be done virtually. There are a lot of advocates that are online and very, very active. So that's fine as well. We do like advocates to be knowledgeable about the treatment options in their area and some of the concerns or issues around some of these treatment options that other patients may be having, because the role is comprehensive. They are representing their community. And the basic knowledge of regulatory science, I cannot emphasize that enough. That is very important. It doesn't mean you have to necessarily be an MD or a scientist, but to have some basic knowledge of, what an endpoint is, what a biomarker is. Those are very helpful in participating in the conversation. As I mentioned, this committee is comprised of scientists and all sorts of other disciplines. So to be able to even know what they're talking about is really helpful, so they can jump in there and contribute. The good communication skills. This is important as well. I know of many advocates who are wonderful on paper and very active, but maybe they have some issues speaking publicly. These are public meetings. This is a room full of, like I said, it could be intimidating to some patients. So I do have to emphasize that as well. At these meetings, oftentimes you'll have media present, especially if it's a controversial issue. Sometimes media will be in touch and try to get a quote. So we just have to prepare that patient rep for what could be. But so far we've been very fortunate. We've had some great advocates at the table, but the communication skills is very important. And commitment to service. This is a very important role that the agency takes very seriously. The lead time for assignments is generally several months. Once in a while, we may have a shorter lead time, but the commitment to service is so important because we rely on that patient to be present. So we try to get something on their calendar as soon as possible. And have them work their schedule around that. And that's always helpful. The last thing we want is not to have a patient present at all. So far we've been really good at that. But lastly, I did want to share that the agency is very committed to increasing the diversity of racial, ethnic, and gender minorities. So enhancing that participation is important. So I really encourage candidates who are representing these groups to apply. And I also wanted to share a link. The FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence does have a project equity, and they're really looking at making sure that the data that we receive represents that particular patient population well. So you can go to that link and find out more about that project. Next slide. So this is the trickier part of the criteria. These are the conflicts of interest. The financial parts are not as complicated. We kind of know what the thresholds are. We look at someone's financial portfolio and try to determine, where are there any funds in stocks of companies that may be relevant to a meeting, for example. That's really important because we want to make sure that that patient is not going to necessarily be, their stock is not going to be impacted by the decision that the FDA makes based on the recommendation. So looking at the financial portfolio is very important. Looking at any ties that that patient has to advocacy groups, whether it's being on a board, whether it's a volunteer, whether you're paid, looking at the organizations themselves, finding out how are they funded, how are they supported. So we have to essentially follow the funds and make sure that that particular candidate doesn't have any ties or have any appearances of a conflicts of interest. So we do like to probe a lot when we interview them to make sure that there are things that they're able to share that, we can kind of delve in and decide, okay, what do the optics look like in this? For example, participating on a clinical trial. If you were to participate on a clinical trial for an assignment where company X was coming to that meeting, it would present, the optics would not be good because you're in the trial. So if you're having great outcomes, for example, if you recommend approval, it could present a difficult conflicts of interest. Ties to CROs, IRBs, those are things we look at as well. What is the nature of your role? Do you look at confidential information? Are you looking at safety and effectiveness data? Grant or contract review work, that as well. We just ask follow-up questions on the nature of whatever activities that they're participating in. Next slide. So we do not put patient reps, at these meetings without giving them some sense of what to expect. Some of the patient reps are fantastic and they are very familiar with FDA and they know how to operate, they know how we operate, they know how to present themselves and what is expected of them. So that's pretty easy. But then we have patient reps who there is a learning curve and we have to kind of give them some resources so that they're able to better understand what's expected of them. So I do on the front end, some training with them just to make sure that they have a comprehension of what to expect, maybe watch some previous meetings of how other patient reps have operated and the nature of what they're contributing, those kind of things. So there is a little bit of time on the front end for preparing them. Next slide. So a couple of years ago, we had filmed several of the patient reps just to get their perspectives as they've been serving in their role. Gigi McMillan has experience in pediatric oncology, and so I wanted to share a link to her testimony along with some of the other patient rep testimonies so that you can kind of learn from their perspective what it's like to serve in this capacity. Next slide. And that's it. I hope this was helpful for you. If you're considering applying, please do. My contact information is here, and please email me if you have any questions. I believe we're going to have a Q&A, so I'm going to hand it off to Colleen.
Thank you, Salina. And
Sure.
thank you also, Breeze. We all appreciate the information that you shared.